it was quite important that both the camera and the alien had this very objective gaze and were not necessarily judging the content of the frame. And I think, you know, from our conversations about who she was or who it was, it became quite apparent that the camera, you know, should follow her in that respect, and that it shouldn't go down a route that would be more human, certainly initially. I think we both knew that we wanted to really use, I think naturalism was key in it, and both the good side of naturalism, you know, and the grittier side of urban, real sodium lighting and that kind of thing. Inevitably, though, it becomes more complicated than just going somewhere and rolling the camera, because a lot of places aren't photographable as one might experience them. John made it, I think, quite clear that one of his aims wasn't to stage and then restage action in the car and thereby limit the non-actors and also the actors in terms of having to replay scenes. And he wanted to free up that action so that it didn't have that normal constraints of driving footage, which is incredibly time consuming to do generally, to move a camera within a moving vehicle. And it's then quite a particular ask on the performances to replay a certain scene for the reverse angle or for the two shot or for the close-up. So I think once it had been established that he wanted to be able to give the people travelling, whether or not they knew they were being filmed, the freedom to react to each other and the environment, that then drove the process of looking for that camera.
We needed to be able to capture multiple angles to kind of enhance the reality of that, and I think John loved the idea that you could cut from one camera to the other and it would be an undisturbed moment, so the light moving across somebody's face would be continuous. All those moments would be unbroken and, you know, very compellingly real because of that. And whilst doing that, both the main actor, Scarlett, and her victims would not be aware of which camera was filming them. They would ideally not be aware of the cameras at all, so we had to develop a system that would allow that to happen. The camera is a tiny little box which is kind of a 2-inch cube on which you mount very small lenses which are normally used for purposes like surveillance, so it's really as small as a camera can be.
The most we ever ran simultaneously was 10. We had 12 units with us, but for some of the van stuff we had 10 cameras in the cab and also outside. It was pretty, those were interesting times.
There are lots of small cameras out there, but it's always a compromise. It's always like, well, you can shoot with this camera, you can put it on, you know, somewhere unusual, but it's going to not look so great. Which, you know, is great for lots of things, sort of crash cams, action cams, all that stuff. But John was like, I don't want to compromise. I want it to look as good as the rest of the film, because so much of the film happened in that space. And then subsequently, there were other uses were kind of popped up. I guess because the opportunity was there to shoot in that way, to shoot sort of covertly, and for the pictures to look great, that John kind of capitalised on that.
They were not magical, they were very real, but they had a quality that sort of sees, sort of very much like your eye sees, and that was our principle, was to make a system that felt objective actually, but also had its own beauty.
But there were interesting constraints, and you know, as with most interesting projects, the constraints become the challenge and become the creativity. I mean, those limitations then drive you into, you know, solutions that you might not otherwise be in. And I think that was one of the strengths of the film, was that when non-actors were brought to the set and asked to do things, they weren't feeling the gaze of the camera upon them.
Both the club scene and the shopping mall were
exhaustively planned, really. Lots of times us going there and just hanging out and walking around and sort of talking about it, and then devising places where we would want to shoot from, and then me coming away with an idea about how the camera should be hidden, really. Whether they were in a cleaning cone or inside a bag, or, you know, they were hidden, so you couldn't see them. So once you can't see the camera, we aren't a crew.
The film I liked her the most in was Vicky Cristina Barcelona, the Woody Allen film. I thought she was fantastic in that film. And I also liked her in a music video that she had made. She's on a photo shoot and she's being made up and everybody's laughing at her jokes and they're giving her, you know, lovely flowers in the dressing room and she's being sport rotten, you know, by everybody. And, you know, like the Queen thinks the world smells of fresh paint, that kind of thing going on. And then she gets out, she leaves the shoot, so I think Salman Rushdie gives her a hug, and it's all like just this perfect world of privilege and celebrity. And then she gets into a car, and then she closes the car with a big bunch of flowers that these two clients have given her, and they wave her off, and she waves them off, and the camera goes with her in the car, and then her face just drops. And you see the whole thing was her artifice, it was her pretense. And I saw the character in that moment. Yeah, and I saw her as the character, absolutely in that moment. That was it. That was the piece. That was the shot. If there was one shot of everything she's ever done that confirmed it for me, it was that.
The cast is a mixture of some professional actors, some untrained people who do acting, who I'd worked with before, like Paul Brannigan and Joe Zula, and then there were professional actors like Michael Moreland, Christoph Haddock. But the bad man was quite a difficult character to cast in a lot of ways because he was very important to Jonathan artistically. We also had a very specific skill set. He definitely wanted them to be racing a bike and he wanted it to be the same person, no body doubles. I can't remember if it was locations or production team, I can't remember which of the guys it was. He was in the recce, he said, have you ever heard of Ghost Rider in Sweden? Who's this man who does illegal riding and stunts and is completely unknown and has never been unmasked. And Jonathan phoned us and asked us to find him on a Friday night. And I was just like, oh my God, here we go. The guys in my office spent all weekend trying to track this guy down. We did actually track him down. We did find out who he was and we did get a Skype call with him. And then he disappeared in a puff of smoke. So what we started doing was looking for people in the professional racing scene. We had tapes coming from Australia. We had literally all over the world, America, everything. And Jeremy McWilliams, who plays the part, had been suggested to us relatively early on. Jonathan said, you know what, I really like something about that guy. And they met and they really hit off and it seemed the right fit. There are relatively few people who have a facial deformity who seemed comfortable being on camera. We sat down with Adam in a room and we talked to him. Jonathan talked to him. Jim asked him some questions. Jonathan asked him some questions. And I shot it on film. And John looked back at that with Walter. And they took some of that and they fed that into the script. And so a lot of that were very natural responses. Maybe that made Adam more comfortable with the lines, I don't know. Because again, he'd been on screen before, but he hadn't acted, so it's a very, very different thing. But I think a lot of it was very natural because it was essentially his own words. So the story of Dave Acton, our woodsman, was actually, that was a real team effort because Dave owned one of the locations that we were looking at for filming. Initially we started with a chat and we talked to him about the film and what it would mean and was he comfortable possibly being on camera, and he said he was. And then we tried some improvisations with him. We didn't want to put him in a difficult position and we didn't want to put Scarlett in a difficult position because the scenes are very challenging. I mean, he's trying to rape her, you know, so that would be hard for anyone to be involved in, no matter how experienced or even if you'd done that sort of scene before. We went out into the streets of Govan with the camera and with Dave and we kind of did some scenes when he was meant to be attacking me, and we really needed to push it to check that he was going to be okay with it. And it was very hard for him, and he would kind of run at me and then sort of stop and apologise and go, I can't, oh no, I'm so sorry. But I just sort of had to say to him, you've got to just go for it.
really it was a massive organisation process, because there was a lot of footage on, certainly on particular days where they were shooting in the van, and 9 cameras were rolling for like up to 4 hours a night. So 30 odd hours of material would come in at one moment in time, and you've got 24 hours until the next lot comes in. So to process that, as in organise it, make sense of it, select it, we went through a process with all of that material where we stacked it up on 9 layers and created 9, actually it's 8, picture-in-pictures. So you could actually view, the plan really was to be able to view all of these cameras simultaneously, so that you were selecting and judging moments in time rather than camera angles, because those camera angles were fixed, so you were looking for content. So really my job up in Scotland was getting all of that organised so that when the shoot finally came to a sort of a conclusion, we had everything ready to go and start editing, kind of with knowing where every frame was. So we were cutting 9 or 10 scenes a week. For 10 weeks. We got to a point where we'd cut them all together. We'd cut all the scenes, and then at the end of that 10-week period, we cut the scenes together to make a film, in inverted commas. Of course, it wasn't going to be a film, and that was a eureka moment, because it was terrible. It was 88 scenes that had naturally had no relationship to any of the others, and it was just this series of short films, and I was 2.5 months in the cutting room, and probably, I think, 3 or 4 months prior to that. I was 7 months into a process with nothing to show for it. And that was definitely a eureka moment. And the eureka moment was, you kind of start again. Actually, weirdly, I think that was sort of the eureka moment we had. And I remember, because John's been through this a few times before, he put his arm around me and said, "Don't worry, Paul, it'll be all right, because we know the footage now. We know, and we did. We knew the material inside out. We had between us almost a photographic memory of 230 hours of material. John was very keen at places within the film to layer things up. He wanted to see multiple images, and I think there's something about it somehow, I think it's part of an alien perspective, if you like. It's the inability to process something, so you just put them on top of each other. And then when you hit upon something like that, and it's like, that's it. That's what it needs to be at that moment. That sense of preciousness, and like almost like a Russian icon painting. That goldness that comes through humanity just felt very poetic in that moment. And it wasn't designed, and it wasn't stumbled upon, but it came out of one of a series of going up streets and going down cul-de-sacs to see what's there. There's a 7 or 8 minute sequence in the film that is basically takes the place of maybe 4 lines in the script. There's a scene 14 in the script, is basically getting to know Laura. So Laura's been to the shopping centre, she's been to Debenham, she's got some clothes, she's got in a van, she's put some lippy on. And it's from that moment, it's about discovering who she is, what she's doing, how she's doing it. For me, I'd say that was a very intricate and a very complex editorial challenge, and we spent many, many weeks really working on that 7 or 8 minutes. And it was something that we didn't even begin to attempt until we'd finished a first pass of the whole film, because I think we kind of needed to have an idea of exactly who we wanted Laura to be able to define her within that scene 14 up front. When you land on the beach and you're slightly in more traditional filmmaking land, you want to know, you want to understand that you are seeing this now from an alien perspective, and that I feel was a massive task, actually.
When I started scouting in sort of the summer of 2011, sort of 6 months or so before we started shooting, sort of going to pretty much the whole north, south, east and west of the country and searching for these locations. Obviously we was looking for beaches and for beauty and for inner city stuff, so across the board a great snapshot of Scotland, which was a joy to spend a lot of time doing. We were originally looking to find a Eden-like location, like a kind of Shangri-La magical place location, where at the end of the film she sort of laid down to sleep before she gets woken up and chased, and then the end scene ensues. And I was up in the Highlands looking for this kind of incredibly beautiful magical spot that I spent kind of weeks and weeks looking for, trying to capture this beauty. And I remember one evening at the end of a week, I got an email from John saying, "Fuck Eden," which is what we've been sort of spending a lot of time looking for. And it was all about it not being this kind of magical place that she ended up, and it now being a forest, and it taking on a more kind of agricultural, industrial end location, which kind of made more sense to why that woodsman was in that location. So that was an interesting kind of change from one concept originally to another, and the way the script was developing through the whole process. Deciding that we were going to discard this Eden philosophy and it becoming more about a forest. When we were around these forests, we'd noticed that the edge to the forest has a real harsh edge where they've felled trees. They've taken a long line of trees down and they gave it this kind of a sharp edge that we sort of named buzzcut as a kind of conceptual description for this kind of really abrupt end to a forest. So we discovered that actually that look was something that we were really after. We wanted that on as big a scale as possible. We wanted it to feel remote, and we wanted it to feel like in the middle of nowhere. We wanted big background behind it. So I was literally going around forests trying to explain this buzz cut to the local forest people who kind of were giving me strange looks about, you know, one knockdown tree looks rather much like another, and you know, like, no, but it's got to be big and it's got to be flat and it's got to be straight and it's got to be having a large area out front. So lots of travelling around forests and, you know, finally finding something that I thought looked good, and I immediately knew it was the right one. Particularly the things like the shopping centre or the nightclub or the cafe or quite a lot of the driving. It was John's vision for this to be a kind of covert way of filming these locations, and initially that was a kind of you know, you question, you know, why are we not doing this the conventional filming way? You know, we're shooting in a nightclub, why do we not just fill it with extras? Or, you know, we're shooting in a shopping centre, just fill it with extras. And then you think about how many awful nightclub scenes you've seen on telly or in films about with people kind of dancing out of time to the music. It suddenly became like a real challenge, but also a kind of fabulously interesting way of working to go along this undiscovered, unknown, with it all being so secretive, but her in these real life environments. You know, to try and just firstly keep it a secret so that the word didn't get out that Scarlett was in this nightclub. Then that was in advance of the filming, and then once we were there, you know, trying to keep the fact that they were doing sort of repeat takes of the same move. So yet suddenly this girl would walk down the corridor, this girl would be into the middle of the dance floor, trying to keep people away from them to a degree, but not to try and blow your cover. So it was a totally unique way of working, which actually made it, you know, even more exciting.
A lot of MICA's music has an incredible sense of otherness about it. Its use of processing and twisting and distorting and detuning. As soon as we sat down with her, it was very obvious that this was the way to go.
A few things that sort of helped decide on instrumentation and stuff like that was that John really early on said that he'd love it to be performed live. So I was sort of thinking, oh, I'll be writing a score that would be notated and written out, and I played the viola, and that's the best way for me to sort of write music like that. So I use a keyboard, synthesized strings and viola, and I just wrote a lot of different bits of music, just improvised a lot, and tried to come up with fairly long form pieces of music.
There are absolutely things that we put in the music that are noises. There are chords. Mika and me refer to something as the brown chord, which is sound, and it's operating as a sonic function in the absence of kind of formal human music.
I don't know if John or Pete would agree with it, but I sort of have I sort of see the music and very simply representing different things in the film very clearly. I mean, it is quite traditional in that it's thematic, anyway, which I think is clear. But then, I mean, each sort of aspect of the music represents a different thing in the film, or a different kind of force in the film. That melody that comes in throughout, that's kind of her seductive tool, that's kind of fake. That's not coming as much from her in how John sort of suggested that it should be coming from her gut or whatever. It's sort of more something that she's putting on, like her makeup, like her outfit. It's kind of a fake luring in tool. So there's that, which sort of starts to work back on her later on in the film. And then, so the symbols, for instance, represent the landscape, just the planet and nature, and nature and undefined forces that are sort of around. It's kind of that's what that's doing, I reckon. And then that's the very fidgety music played, fast moving music, tremolos on the strings is the alien pressure. It's like the alien, undeniable life force that we can't understand, but that is pressurizing her and is present all the time. And then you've got this human feeling of love, which is a sort of triad, which is developed into a theme and all of this and that. And then the drums is sort of her. That's it. The drums is her kind of work, her hunger. That fake MIDI strings aspect and the real strings in there. That combination is that sort of aesthetic is, I think, is important because of her sort of slightly dislocated experience. But then, I mean, and actually, it's much more natural when she's working. It's more acoustic instruments, and then as she gets towards love, it's much more synthesized. I think that's because it's more impossible. I like the idea of a string, synthesized strings, because it can go on forever, and there's no human having to change their bow. It's just there for us until you turn it off.
We were greedy. We wanted the best of everything. So there would be these fantastic recording sessions with hand-picked musicians, and we would figure out the process of getting the results. Same with the sound of the drums and the rhythms. There would be a combination of just the simple stuff coming from a laptop, but then we'd work that, and we'd get live players in, and we would sit until the end result wasn't compromised. Even though if it sounds better, it's easy to make something sound better, but it's also easy to lose a lot of quality in that process.
It's quite different. It's quite different to how it started out. Yeah, it was full of stuff at first, it got really stripped back, but if I'd gone in there and sort of come up with where it sort of ended up, I don't think everyone would have been like, no.
I think that from the very beginning, he wanted to work with us with that face. The root of that image is a frame grab from the film. He wanted to use the image. I just stuck with the image, and then we just moved forward from there. The very first conversation we had, I'm telling you, I don't have a lot of time. I'm like, look, in order to get to something that's appropriate for this film, and not just kind of an esoteric, pretty picture, because it's not that difficult to make a pretty picture. But in order to make something that is authentic, genuine and appropriate, is a lot more difficult. And so I was like, look, I'm going to fail a lot, but I just decided right then, I felt comfortable talking to him, just 10 minutes after talking to him, that I would just send him everything I did. Like I told him, I said, you had 10 years to make the film, and I had 10 hours to make the advertising. And we just kind of quickly went through it. I think it was like I just worked all weekend, and yeah, it was very quick, but very intense days. And there's not that many different versions, but there's a lot of iterations of of a particular tangent, let's say. And then there'd be another sort of move, and then there'd be a million versions of that. There's only a handful of other clients that I have that I'd be able to get, to something like this with. Mika was like, she was telling my wife, it's like, oh, the poster's everywhere, and it's pretty amazing because no one's drawn a dick on it yet. That was her measure of success. It was like, it's successful because no one has drawn a dick on the poster yet.
Anything that isn't an actor or the cameras or the lights are kind of down to the designer, really. And it's about sort of realising the path through the film and visually. I mean, everything we shot non-chronologically became a major, not on screen, but a major issue for my department, because we got snow when we shouldn't have snow. We've got ice and snow when it was, going to fit with a scene that had no snow in it. With no fake snow around, it was just completely, arduous. Finding the right van that would effectively be a set and a recording studio, and generate power, and be somewhat anonymous on the street was quite a task. And then housing the cameras, albeit they were small cameras, they weren't that small, and they had to be not seen. We had the sort of portals, the gaps between, or the places, the meeting points between our world and hers, or theirs, were, fairly quickly became, derelict houses. And I remember distinctly talking about this with John and thinking, well, that'll be fine. Derelict houses, there'll be plenty of them there. I'd shot in Glasgow before. I'd seen how bits of it were degenerated and fairly, derelict. I thought that would be fine. Nothing further from the truth. Couldn't find any. And the reason we couldn't find any was that those that were actually empty had been blocked up and, knocked into such decrepitude that it made no sense that anyone would walk into it. It was just too far gone. You can't change the idea because you need to find something simpler. You've got to push on with the idea, and the idea was a sound one, so we had to create them, basically. Essentially, it was always this kind of nemescus floor, if you like, that the victim would sink into and she wouldn't. And in that sense, obviously, we knew immediately that the victims would need to sink into a liquid, and a liquid would be shiny. And so we thought the best way to get the great contrast would be a reflection. And John was, as with all the scenes, keen to shoot all of it in camera. And what couldn't be created would need to be enhanced, but the mantra, the dogma, is always to shoot something, never to shoot nothing and create afterwards, So I built a stage floor that was black glass, basically. And then within that was a tank of the black liquid, within which was a platform that once the actor started, or the victim started walking onto, it sank, with a bladder inside it which released air as they went in to counteract the Archimedes effect so that it didn't flow over onto the floor.
Sometimes with optioning a book you might start looking for a writer, but this was one that felt that it really needed to be driven by a filmmaker's vision before anything. The idea of an alien in our world, among us, but in which we were in the point of view of the alien, was an inherently cinematic idea, because that's all about the tools of sound and vision. And this is something that Jonathan obviously extrapolated far, far beyond the literary voice.
There was something really exciting about this idea of seeing things through her eyes, seeing the world through an alien lens, really. That was the North Star of the whole thing, really. And even though, we deviated from that, over the course of many drafts, I think where we came back to was that same impulse, which was to tell a story from her point of view, and to have an opportunity to, and the challenge, I suppose, of seeing things through a fresh lens,
Really, anything that anybody says you can't do, that's the stuff we've got to do, is the way to almost like guide ourselves a bit, There isn't sort of like a situation or a moment or a sort of a position in space. I think that, we haven't been through it in one way or another in terms of like, a conversation or actually writing it down. But what's interesting is, that's just done in order to sort of have freedom. It's not done in order to sort of like, okay, now let's lock this down. It's done to sort of go, okay, now let's let it off the reins. Let's let things let life in.
We worked on a script which was much more embellished, much more plot, many more characters, more conventional actually. I would say very good, but we couldn't get the money to make that one. And I'm pleased we couldn't. I never felt 100% comfortable with it. It was a very good script, but it didn't quite concentrate on the kind of molten core of it.
I mean, I'd say almost all of the themes in that iteration survive. It's just sort of told differently.
We could tell the same thing by distilling it. Like, for instance, the creation scene, the beginning scene of the film, which is the eye, started as the construction of the whole body, every aspect of it. Huge, probably a 10-minute scene, £1 million. And it ended up being, the construction of an eye, a rod going into a sphere that you might think is a kind of the alignment of a planet or spaceships docking or something. And actually it's the formation of an eye. And then the scene that we had in an earlier script, which was this training, these sort of voice exercises and voice coaching and all that, became the things, the very thing that Scarlett had to do to learn how to speak with an English accent. So we used those. So an I with those sounds was a distillation of a much longer, earlier incarnation of the same idea. So having spent, many, many months and years working on scenes that were so important to us, suddenly we were just, jettisoning, really, and it was very liberating. And her story and everything that was about her suddenly came back to the fore.
We did, in truth, like really sort of examine it from all angles. So there was sort of really a broad sort of, look at what might happen in sort of every possible situation. So that was all sort of there as a sort of a safety net almost, like what if this happens, what would we do, or what would be the way around that, or how would we pull out of that, or how would that connect with the story?
Walter and I were trying to find ways of describing that entity by putting it in situations, in situations where we were faced with things that were intensely human, that we get, emotion. We would have emotional responses to that can only be human. And then we watch her response to the same thing and see that she's not responding the way we are. She's not feeling anything. And then we just keep layering that on,
There's a moment whenever he was shooting that kid, and the kid tries to stand up, and it's so fucking heroic. It's like that kid has learned to sort of walk in the horror of that moment, in in the depths of that moment, he's going to get on his feet, you know, and that actually to me is like the frame of the film that I love, you know, it's just that kid trying to stand up.
The way we are getting inside that alien's head is by looking at us as if we were a foreign object.
We wanted to present the idea that this alien entity wanted us for something, but what exactly they wanted us for wasn't necessary. You can't show an alien entity, it's not possible, but you can allude to one, you can allude to the idea of it, or the feeling of it, the dread of it. She's not really a she, even, is she? She's an it, and it is a force. It's a dispassionate. It's a dispassionate entity. It's like the sea, you know. The craft was her, you know. The spaceship was her. The body is craft. I mean, that's very much the sort of a central idea in the film. The paradox of body and soul, you know. So that was our science fiction. She's our science fiction.
It was such a long journey doing the sound that where we started and where we ended, you know, there was nothing prescriptive about it. It was for the large part John and I and interaction with Peter RAEBURN and MICA LEVI and trying things and finding what worked and what didn't, and easily kind of, you know, 99% of it was discarded but had to be taken to its kind of full finished product before you could throw it out. The kind of noisy sounds that you'd normally take out, you know, kind of knocks and bangs and a lot of background noise and all the kind of stuff that's inherent in more documentary type filmmaking. Normally all that would be removed, but we kind of played to those strengths. So the fact that comes across as alien in the environment of the cinema helps with that journey, and also it helps describe her journey. The sound under the void is pretty interesting. It's Dan Landin came up with the idea on the set. He said, it'd be a good idea to hear something dry and crunchy under here, you know, and from that we started looking down that avenue because we thought, yeah, and we tried many different things, like, you know, obviously leaves, crunching leaves. A big component of it that is in the final mix is we put rice suspended on a tray kind of at an angle so that it was a bit zero gravity, like if you pushed it, it would keep moving, but if you didn't, it wouldn't. And that kind of lent an idea to there being sort of molecules that you couldn't see around him. And then the rest was very close mic'd movement of body parts, you know, that kind of clicking and stuff, all recorded in a scientific space. And yeah, it's really quite uncomfortable.
Key parts of it needed a sort of visual development, particularly in terms of the look and well, not so much even the look, but the concept of the alien and what it was and what it could be, and whether there was a backstory for the alien, what that world would be. It was kind of very open visual research to accompany the writing process. So John was sort of ducking backwards and forwards between very intensive writing and us doing sort of massive visual brainstorming at that time, producing lots of images, looking at all sorts of very, very varied sources, trying to find things that were resonant and just kicking lots of ideas around, and you know, very unusual position to be allowed to be in at that stage. You know, it was ostensibly visual effects, but really it was sort of concept development and just sort of exploring things that didn't exist.
The biggest challenge is to try and get inside the head of the director to find out what the director wants. And in some cases, the director might come to you with a very clear vision, and together with art department may have sort of predetermined everything that's going to appear in the film. But that wasn't the case with Under the Skin, and that wouldn't be John's way of approaching things. Although we did do, for example, we did some previs, but the previs was not how things ended up in the film. It was just a way into thinking through that part of shooting. You know, a lot of visual effects shots that we do last 3 seconds or 2 seconds, or, you know, it's something exploding and it lasts a fraction of a second. and this was shots that were 10, 15 seconds long, and that's a challenge in itself because you've got nowhere to hide. But also there was underlying it, there's a very strong performance, first of all by Scarlett, and then by the actress who plays the black alien inside. So it's all driven by quite a slow, measured performance, peeling her human skin off. But then that had to reveal something other than the actress's head. So there's the sort of head and shoulders are not there in the shot plate. And then there had to be a sort of that CG figure had to have a performance as well, and that was something that John wanted to have a very close control over. It's almost a non-performance. It's very sort of muted the action there, and yet there's a lot conveyed in that sequence. There's when the black alien is looking at Laura's face. That's that's obviously a key moment. Some of it is real snow. Some of the time, it's shot in various different weather conditions, and some of it is CG snow falling. And John, I remember, he said, well, it would be great if some snow would land on, and of course that just sort of ramps things up in complexity. But we managed to go out and shoot a little bit of some snowflakes falling onto something black, and drop that in. And of course, he's absolutely right. It's a little detail, a little touch that just makes makes the shot land in some way.
What Dom and I are both very proud about is the fact that nobody seems to mention the visual effects at all. They just sort of accept that it's happening, which to us means we've done our job. Supporting reality is and supporting the story is what it should be on every aspect of filmmaking, I think.